Hello, hello, and welcome back. We are here for the next session, and I am super stoked, super happy to have my good friend here. We've got Dr. Michelle Lilly, and she is going to be doing a session called But What Happened Next? Take it away, my friend.
All right. Thank you, Betty. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Ricardo threatened me that I had to lose time on my presentation. Just kidding, Ricardo. He said the opposite.
Oh, dude,
But
that's messed up.
Ricardo and I have too much fun together. Apologies. Okay, so what am I going to be talking about today? I'm going to be talking about call outcome, right? But first, as a way of a quick intro, my name is Michelle Lilly. I'm a professor at NIU. I've been there since 2009, so oh my gosh, 14 years. I'm also the owner and provider of Lilly Counseling and Consultation. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Illinois. I do evidence-based treatments for PTSD, depression, anxiety, and first responders and their families. I do training and education in the areas of PTSD, suicide, stress management, resilience, peer support, all the things. And then sometimes I do consulting work for agencies who are struggling, oftentimes by starting off with a kind of thorough organizational assessment, and then when organizations are struggling with any number of issues, whether or not that's interpersonal issues or relational aggression or kind of leadership concerns, then sometimes I go in and try to help them out. I've been doing this for a little bit over a decade. My background in 911 started in 2009 when I started at NIU. I had an undergraduate who was working in my lab. She was a non-traditional undergraduate. Her name is Heather Pierce. And one day she came up to me and she said, "Hey, I don't know if you knew this, but I worked as a 911 telecommunicator for 7 years before coming back to school. And I did a little literature search, and there's nothing related to mental health in 911. Of course, then she started telling me about the job. My jaw progressively started to unhinge and hit the floor as I heard about all of the challenges that are inherent in the 911 work environment. And to know that there had been literally zero research done, I said, we need to do something. So she leveraged the connections that she had. We did the first survey on the prevalence of PTSD and depression in 911. That data was published in 2012, which was just a little over a decade ago. It's also when I first met Ricardo, too. I was one of his early guests on his podcast. And so I published that research, invited to a number of different conferences to speak about the results. And I honestly kind of thought, oh, this was an interesting project and I will move about my life. But the 911 industry had different plans for me. They told me that I was no longer allowed to leave and that I needed to continue doing research. So I've been doing that over the last decade, in addition to doing the clinical work with 911 telecommunicators and their families, as well as law enforcement and fire. So that's a little bit about my background. And I'm one I've continued to do a number of different research projects, some of which I'll talk about today. So, what I was really struck by when I very first started to go to 911 conferences, talk to telecommunicators, was the extent to which people would say to me, well, first of all, we all know the stories, right? People oftentimes will, in certain environments, talk about their worst calls, their worst events, things that have stuck with them the most. And I started to notice some themes. One of them was the extent to which people struggled when they didn't know what happened next. So I would hear things like, I never found out what happened. How are they doing now? Right? Whatever happened to these folks that I shared this really critical and difficult moment with? I've had clients say to me things like, their life was surely destroyed. There's no way they could have moved on from that. They didn't actually know that, right? So I heard a lot of these kind of hints about the implications of not knowing the outcome of a call. I've also heard over time a lot of questions of, why can't I let this go? Why can't I let this one particular call go? So I've had clients, people from the industry say things to me like, why does this bother me? I don't even know what happened to the people. I've had people say things like, it comes to me most at night when I'm trying to sleep, when I'm trying to fall asleep, and all of a sudden, that's right there in my head. I've had people say things to me like, I've handled worse. So why this one particular call? Right? Well, as a clinical psychologist, there's a lot in here that makes sense to me, right? When we don't know the outcome of a call, there's a reason why, from a PTSD perspective, it can stick with us more. So I'm going to just run through this a little bit. If you've seen me speak before about PTSD and the different symptoms and how they hang together, you have my permission for the next 6.5 minutes to check your email, but then please confirm. Okay. So PTSD is defined by 4 symptom clusters. Okay, so there are 4 clusters of PTSD symptoms, and if you don't have symptoms across all 4 clusters, you wouldn't be diagnosed with PTSD. And when I get to how these clusters all hang together, I think it might be a little bit more clear why I'm talking about call outcomes. So hang in there. So this first symptom cluster is re-experiencing symptoms. And I often call these kind of the Hollywood or hallmark symptoms of PTSD. These are the flashbacks, the nightmares, the distress when reminded of previous events. Oftentimes these are called triggers. Although for those of you who have heard me talk, I am triggered by the word trigger because everyone uses trigger, including my 11-year-old twins who will be like, oh my God, I was so triggered by that. And then I say, don't you use that word. Intrusive thoughts are another re-experiencing symptom that we see. Intrusive thoughts are thoughts that pop into your head when you least want them to, often at times of low distraction. They cause distress, they cause discomfort, they are unwanted. So this is different than not letting go. So not letting go is when people kind of often intentionally will think about something over and over and over again. And that's called rumination. If we have time, maybe we can dip into some of what rumination is and the implications for that, but we probably won't. These symptoms cause distress. Okay, so if I say to somebody and I'm doing a clinical evaluation and I say, hey, do you have nightmares or flashbacks? And they say, yeah, on occasion. And I say, well, how long does it take you to kind of recover? For example, are you able to go back to sleep pretty quickly? Are you able to kind of take a couple minutes and then move about your day? If they say, yeah, that I'm okay, then that's really kind of not what we're thinking about in terms of PTSD. It's not what I'm looking for as a trauma clinician. I'm looking for experiences where people have these intrusive thoughts, they have nightmares, and it's really hard for them to recover, and they have a really strong physiological response. The next symptom cluster is avoidance. So people with PTSD will actively avoid people, places, things, memories that remind them of previous distressing events. This is not a preference, right? So when I work with law enforcement, for example, if I say they handled a critical incident in a particular area of town, and I say to them, "Are you still on patrol in that area?" And they say, "No, not every day." "Are you ever?" Sometimes. Okay, when you go there, does it bother you? If they say something like, "Yeah, it kind of bothers me, but not really. I'd rather not, but I can do it," then again, it's kind of not meeting that threshold for PTSD. What we see in the case of PTSD with avoidance is people very actively avoid things. And if they're forced to confront things that they've been avoiding, oftentimes it will come with a very strong physiological and psychological response. Okay, so the third symptom cluster, I'm trying to rush ahead here, is hypervigilance. People with PTSD often have trouble sleeping, they have difficulty concentrating, they may have problems with irritability, angry outbursts. Oftentimes, what I see in first responders is folks getting amped up really hours before they even need to go to work. I've seen this even people getting up in the morning, they don't have to be in until the evening shift and already they're starting to notice some physiological responding. So oftentimes what I say about folks with PTSD is that they're at an 11, right? If the scale goes to 10, they're often walking around an 11. If you don't know that reference, you need to watch the movie Spinal Tap. Okay, the fourth symptom cluster is changes in mood and cognition. So what we see in the context of PTSD is oftentimes people having very overly negative thoughts, sense of a foreshortened future, meaning that if I ask somebody, what do you think you're going to be up to in a year? Sometimes they have a really hard time envisioning or imagining their future. High levels of self-blame and guilt. Self-blame and guilt, I call the kind of dirty emotions that oftentimes drive PTSD. We see depressed mood and difficulty experiencing positive emotions. And there's more and more research going into this kind of difficulty in positive emotions with time. And that's because we're seeing it more and more in PTSD, or maybe we're noticing it more. Research suggests that part of the difficulty that people develop in experiencing positive emotions is that in the context of distress, they start trying to avoid the negative emotions. I don't want to feel sad. I don't want to feel confused. I don't want to feel angry. So I'm just going to avoid those emotions. But unfortunately, we don't get to pick which emotions we avoid versus those which we feel. So it's really hard to just say, I'm going to avoid emotions, but only the bad emotions without affecting the positive emotions. So oftentimes what we see is this overall blunting of emotional responding, which might work a little bit in kind of staving off some of the negative emotions, but it also really dampens down experiencing some of those positive emotions. A lot of people call this kind of the depression cluster of PTSD, and that's because it looks a whole lot like depression. What I also say is that this is remarkable if these aren't at least somewhat affected by your work. Um, I kind of liken working in 911 to often working with some pretty, what I call shitty humanity, people doing bad things to each other, people having unjust things happen to them, lack of justice and meaning in the world are things that you kind of recurrently see. And over time, that can certainly affect our mindset and how we view the world. Okay, so how do these things go together? And thank you for bearing with me as I walked through the 4 symptom clusters. So how do these symptoms hang together? Because I know some of them might seem a little bit counterintuitive. Like, how can you be hypervigilant and have high levels of arousal, but also be avoidant? That doesn't make sense. Well, PTSD starts with distress and some hypervigilance, right? So we don't develop PTSD because you've had a good day, right? PTSD starts with one or more events where there's been a high level of emotional distress. And emotional distress makes sense. We are humans, and we're responding to the suffering of other human beings. When we feel helpless, when we feel out of control, we experience stress. And when that stress is too high, we become distressed, right? So that's oftentimes the start of PTSD. Because we as humans who are interested in our own survival, we then might start to be hypervigilant, right? So if I go for a walk in the woods and I am attacked by a bear, I really hope for my own sake that the next day, if I walk in those woods, I'm looking for the bear. Otherwise, I will be eaten, right? So we start with some of this distress, and in the immediate aftermath of a distressing event, we oftentimes have some of that hypervigilance. We're looking for threat in our environment, and that's our evolution trying to keep us safe and trying to help us survive. Now, we as humans, again, we don't love to feel distress. So oftentimes what we start to do is we avoid. We avoid people, places, things that remind us of the distress. And in the short term, this is a really good tactic, right? It actually makes, again, adaptive sense why we would avoid things that cause us distress, right? Because then lo and behold, we don't have to experience the distress. But the problem with avoidance is that it actually has this counterintuitive impact on re-experiencing symptoms. Our brains like nice, clear, coherent stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in the absence of that, our brain has a really hard time kind of time stamping it and cataloging it as a memory that's kind of part of our narrative, right? Part of our autobiography. And so, in the absence of having an event that has a kind of beginning, middle, and end, and that makes sense to us, our brain almost has this kind of like do not compute response, right? Our brain, because this is what brains do, will continue to try to churn over the event to try to make sense of it, right? And in the absence of that, we get these little intrusive thoughts. We get these nightmares. That's really your brain just trying to figure out what has happened and make meaning of what has happened. But that is why we also get those things when we are in the shower or driving in a car or trying to fall asleep at night. It's times when our brains are not distracted by other things that the brain says to yourself, hey, self, this is now a great time for you to try to figure out what happened. Right? So that's why we experience those symptoms in those moments. We also know that the brain has what we call a rebound effect. So the harder we try to push something down, the more we have a rebound effect. So we liken this as clinical psychologists to the beach ball, right? If you have a little bitty beach ball and you try to push it under the water and you let it go, it might pop up and splash you in the face a little bit. But if you have one of those like big ass beach balls and you're like trying to shove it down and you fall off, it's going to come up and really smack you in the face. So we know that the more that people try to avoid, the more they try to suppress, the larger is the rebound effect later on. And that's because our brain actually can't actively avoid something without bringing it online in the first place. So we can't say, hey, brain, don't think about X without brain saying, haha, what is X? Right? So when we're actively avoiding, when we're actively suppressing, we're actually kind of walking around with kind of preloaded, right? Our brain is actually still kind of thinking about this thing that we're trying to avoid. And then when we're not distracted, all of a sudden your brain is saying, great, now this is a perfect time to start trying to make sense of this. But the problem with those re-experiencing symptoms is that it serves to reinforce the distress and hypervigilance. When we kind of chronically think that stress is everywhere, or sorry, threat is everywhere, we start always paying attention to our environment. And when people are having nightmares, when they're having flashbacks, when they're having intrusive symptoms, it signals an increase in their distress. So we start with distress and hypervigilance, we start to avoid, but this unfortunately increases our re-experiencing, that which then just reinforces the distress and hypervigilance. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there's that 4 symptom cluster, right? So we might be telling ourselves things like the world is messed up. Again, their life is probably destroyed. You might be thinking things to yourself like, I can't deal with this. I have to stop thinking about this. With re-experiencing symptoms, when people have triggers, they might say things to themselves like, why can't I get over this? Or I'm weak, or I shouldn't be doing this job. And as a clinical psychologist that works with trauma, we really call these the thought logs that tend to fuel the PTSD fire. Okay? So I thank you for hanging in as I did a itty bitty mini course on PTSD. But hopefully that is all to illustrate why not knowing the call outcome can sometimes lead to long-term kind of rumination, why it can lead to intrusive thoughts, why it can lead to nightmares. Because when we don't know the call outcome, increases the likelihood that our brain is having a hard time making meaning of the event and then kind of time stamping and cataloging it as a memory. Okay. So the good news, or what I think is the good news because I'm a data nerd, is that I have collected data on this. So I have, in just about every 911 data collection that I've done, asked people, do you know the outcome of your worst duty related call? Or do you know the outcome of the most recent critical call that you've handled? Okay. And so in all these different studies, what I have found is that so I'll give you like a little hint. Like survey says, does call outcome predict PTSD? Nope, right? It didn't matter, right? Come on, data, right? I hate it when this happens because, I've lots of data and, we can run data in lots of different ways. And it doesn't really matter what data set I've looked at. It doesn't matter whether or not I've looked at different time points. It doesn't actually matter even if I look at this cross-sectionally, like at a baseline or longitudinally over time. The results were very inconsistent. And so at some time points, knowing call outcome was statistically connected to risk for PTSD, for depression, for anxiety and stress, but that was never consistent, right? So there are some data points where it will say, yes, those who didn't know their most recent call outcome had higher levels of stress and anxiety and depression, but not PTSD. There have been other data sets where I've looked at, well, PTSD, for not knowing call outcome predicts PTSD at the next data point, but not the longer data points. So all of this is to say that the data was very, very muddy, right? There were some direct findings, right? As I mentioned, it's inconsistent, but generally speaking, not knowing call outcome was typically related to stress, right? So not knowing the outcome of your most recent and worst critical call was connected with a slightly higher level of reports of stress. The same was true for anxiety. The same was true for depression. And the same was actually true for alcohol use. So not knowing your most recent call outcome or your most recent worst call, not knowing the outcome was minimally, but statistically significantly related to higher stress, anxiety, depression, and alcohol use. But again, this was not consistent. And this is not the type of data that I, throw out there and publish because it really was relatively weak findings and it was not consistent over time. Why the inconsistency? Well, first of all, in the most recent data set that I collected, or the second to last most recent data set that I've collected, we started collecting data in fall of 2019, in October and November, and then the second data set occurred in March and April of 2020. right in the context of COVID. It's probably no surprise to you that we saw fluctuation in mood and mental health that was kind of all over the place. Some people showed no changes in their mental health. Some people showed rather drastic changes in their mental health in the context of the onset of COVID. Later that same year, the second data set, or the second, or the, sorry, the third data point for that data collection project was in August, September, October of 2020, when there were elections and there were protests across the country. And so this is part of what is really hard about collecting data on stress and mental health, really in any population, because world events, national level events can really affect the mental health and responding of folks. Also, in a number of the data sets that I've collected, the vast majority actually knew the outcome of their most recent worst event, their most recent worst call. And from a statistical perspective, when you have one group that's very, very large and you're trying to compare it to another group that is very, very small, for statistical reasons that we don't need to get into, it can be really hard to find kind of statistically significant differences. And there's also so many intervening factors. Did they experience a new event? What we have found in a number of data sets that I've collected is that some people report having a worst event that stays consistent regardless of whether or not you collect data every 3 months, every 6 months, over many years. Some people kind of have their worst event and it remains their worst event. For others, what I find is that every time we do the survey time point, they're reporting a new worst event. So what they experience as kind of their worst duty related event tends to kind of change and shift over time. So that might be kind of a trait level differences between them, or it might be that some individuals have more distance from their worst event. So they may have had, for example, more time to recover. They may have had more time to get therapy, to get intervention, to get peer support in ways that can kind of dampen some of the kind of psychological effects that we see in 911. Humans are just noisy, right? We are noisy and we are very hard to study because there can be all sorts of things that happen outside of work, for example, that affect your mental health. The illness of a child, caring for elderly parents, a divorce. All of these things are incredibly stressful life transitions that we oftentimes have a really hard time accounting, and we have a hard time kind of accounting for that noise when we collect data. And the last thing is that I've had a lot of people say to me things like, that wouldn't bother me when it comes to call outcome. So I remember doing a training with Kim Turner out in California one time, and there were a couple people who were saying, like, I didn't know the outcome, and they were kind of complaining because they were saying, like, leadership didn't let us know the call outcome. They don't allow us to follow up. And I remember Kim Turner very like poignantly saying, want to know. It doesn't bother me to not know the call outcome. And the reason it doesn't is because it then allows me to say, I'm sure they're fine and I'm sure they got the help they needed. They're okay. Right. And I said, does it bother you to that you don't know whether or not that's true? She's like, no. Right. I can hang up the phone and say, I did everything that I did. And, I'm sure they're fine. So it really got me thinking, especially when I was looking at this data, as to whether or not maybe this is accounting for some of this noise, right? So then I went back into the data set and looked back at PTSD and thought, okay, is there something else going on that can account for why PTSD was not consistently related to whether or not people know the outcome of the call? Because again, based on theory, we should be seeing that in the data. And I found two variables that are really critical and kind of as intervening factors between knowing call outcome and somebody's risk for developing PTSD. One of them is intolerance of uncertainty. So intolerance of uncertainty is a construct that was really started to gain research attention from the anxiety literature. Intolerance of uncertainty is when somebody, just as it sounds, when they have a really hard time not getting anxious if they don't know if what has happened with something, right? They have a hard time being able to get over not knowing, right? For some people, they cannot know something and just say, oh, well, but for some people, it's really hard. And this is a kind of a personality kind of trait level factor that we all have to some degree, right? some of us were really high on intolerance of uncertainty. We want to know what's going to happen. And if we don't know what's going to happen with something, we're going to be really anxious. Some people might be like a 0 on that scale. They don't seem to need to know what's going to happen, right? So intolerance of uncertainty is a critical construct within the anxiety disorder literature that I started measuring in some of my data sets. And the second was what we call meta memory or confidence in one's memory. And what I found is that, or so what meta memory is the extent to which you kind of trust your memory, the extent to which you believe that your memory is accurate, the extent to which you kind of worry about whether or not your memories are accurate. And again, this is kind of personality trait level factor that everybody has, right? So some people have really high confidence in their memory and they have kind of low concerns about confidence in their memory. And then you have people on the other end of the scale as well, right? And what I found is that when I actually looked at these things in relationship to call outcome and PTSD, is that they intersected. If you don't know the call outcome and you're high on intolerance of uncertainty and you have low confidence in your memory, you're really at risk for PTSD. You could not know the call outcome to something, and it really is not going to increase your risk for PTSD if you have low intolerance of uncertainty or you have high confidence in your memory. So the story is just not that simple, right? It's not, I don't know the call outcome, therefore I'm at risk for PTSD. Therefore, we should always make sure that everybody knows what happens with calls that are distressing to them. But the story is far more complicated. There are personality and trait level factors that intervene in there to predict mental health outcomes. Okay, so what do we do with that information? Well, the first is that if you're struggling, get help, right? I beg of you, right? I'm sure we are all plugged into social media. We see many stories of people who are struggling and make decisions to end their life. It is tragic and it is critically important that people get help. PTSD, depression, anxiety, these are treatable conditions, but they stick around if you don't tackle it. And so what I often say to people is bravery is actually facing your demons, right? A lot of people kind of feel as though if they admit that they're struggling, that it is a sign of weakness. And I always turn that on our head. If you can kind of confront the stigma, if you can confront those demons that are distressing to you, that is bravery. If you have any questions as to what treatments you might be looking for, get an evidence-based treatment and do your homework. So the ptsd.va.gov, particularly if you're looking for a PTSD treatment, is a fantastic resource that can help you kind of determine whether or not there are particular types of treatment to look for. So if you're really struggling, I beg of you, I'm sure everybody on this call begs of you to get help. The other is that we really need to start honoring choice, right? We are grown ass people, right? The people who work in your call center, they are grown or they wouldn't get hired, right? Grown ass people have developed their own individual natural recovery process. As people have gone through their lives and they cope with many different things, they have their own coping methods. They have their own process of recovery. Some of those recoveries and trajectories might not be the most adaptive, but for many it is. For some people, after a critical call, critical incident, they want to talk, they want to process, they want to jump into it, and they know that that's the way for them to recover from it. For other people, they don't want to, right? And we can't force people to talk. We can't force debriefings on people. What I often see when I go to centers is they'll say, we finally got debriefing, and whether or not you want to go, we tell you to go. And that way, people aren't stigmatized for selecting to go. And I understand some of that rationale. But what we know is that forced debriefing might be well intentioned, but is very misguided. In that same data set, the data set that had over 800 folks from across the country, I asked a question about whether or not folks were debriefed after their worst critical call. And what I would tell you is comparing the people who experienced a debriefing to those who did not experience a debriefing did not matter at all in terms of their mental health. It didn't differentially predict PTSD, depression, anxiety, stress, turnover intention, none of it. The only thing that exposure to debriefing predicted was job satisfaction. So people who were able to participate in a debriefing reported higher levels of job satisfaction. Now, what I would say is that there's probably a confounding variable in there. And that confounding variable is that if you were offered the opportunity to go to debriefing, chances are you might be working for an agency that maybe has some more higher levels of prioritization of mental health, right? So forcing debriefing can be really challenging. In that data set, I also asked people if you attended a debriefing, what was your experience of it? And I could pull up some of the qualitative responses, but people would say, some of the people said it was great, right? Some people said, it's fine, meh, right? But some of those qualitative responses, and it was about a third of folks said, I did not want to attend the debriefing and I was forced, and I found it to be very distressing. I had people who reported things like, I went to a debriefing and I found out that the child who was on the call perished, and I really did not want to know that information. I heard from the field responders that X, Y, and Z happened, and it's really effed me up, right? So we really need to honor people's choice. We can facilitate opportunities to learn an outcome, but we should never force it because remember, it may matter to some people, but not all. And that is really based on their own personality, their own traits, their own, again, kind of intolerance of uncertainty and their own confidence in their memory, and their own internal processes for recovery. So we just need to be really careful that we are not ever kind of forcing people to engage with something that they don't want to engage with. What I often talk about is journaling. So, um, I went, if you go to ptsd.va.gov, you'll probably learn of those more kind of long-standing evidence-based treatments for PTSD, like prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. But there's a new protocol called written exposure therapy, or WET. It is based on research showing the kind of salutary effects of writing and journaling, which has a long-standing and robust literature supporting its kind of efficacy in reducing stress and processing events. And what this protocol is, it's 5 sessions of having people sit down and write about their event. It involves very minimal processing. Research is showing that it can be done in groups. And research is showing that it actually can be conducted by paraprofessionals, right? So not somebody who's, spent 6 years getting their PhD, but somebody who is kind of generally trained in trauma, trained in some basic clinical skills, but does not need the advanced training that somebody like me has. And what they're finding with written exposure therapy is that it's as effective as some of these other treatment approaches. It is non-inferior, and in fact, the impacts of it can last over time. Now, this is really great news, right? And it really suggests that even some of the things that we can do at home, like engaging in journaling, can be very effective, particularly if you take a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper and write it out. Don't type it out. That is a different phenomenological experience in your head. There is something that lights up in your brain when you take a piece of pencil, a pen or pencil, and you write, that is different than typing. Right? It's a different experience. And what research is showing is that doing these writing exercises, journaling, just getting the experience out there is incredibly helpful in helping us process events. It doesn't need to be in an intensive therapy. So if for whatever reason you kind of don't want to go to therapy or you don't have time to go to therapy or there's lots of other things, journaling is a really great place to start. And in addition to kind of helping us process, what people are often starting to learn when they finally start engaging with and confronting their traumatic memories is that the experience might be hard, it might be sad, because oftentimes what we're writing about is human suffering, right? And we as humans connect the most through our suffering. So sometimes when we start writing about events that are really tragic, we might start feeling sad. But what people often start to learn when they journal or when they start talking about these things is that they can handle thinking about and talking about these things without falling apart. They increase what we call their distress tolerance, right? They learn that this thing that I've been kind of avoiding, it can be confronted. and I do have kind of the emotional resources to be able to handle it. There's a new treatment approach, which I think is just fascinating. It's actually called rescripting, and it's getting more and more attention. So they actually started developing rescripting uh, in uh, in relationship to trauma-related nightmares, because trauma-related nightmares, even after somebody gets successful treatment for PTSD, sometimes they still end up having some nightmares over time. And so they started doing this kind of exercise where during the day in your waking hours, you take some of the content of kind of common nightmares and you write about it, but you write about it with a different outcome, right? And oftentimes an outcome that is um, you know, positive, is joyous, is something that it might not be true, right? It may be that you're in your real life, you had an event that ended really tragically, and you've been having nightmares. Well, in rescripting, you think about those things during the day, but you write about it having a different outcome. And at first, I'll be really honest, when people started talking about this in the clinical psychology field, I was like, what is this? That seems crazy, right? Uh, but it's actually showing more and more efficacy with more trials. And what happens is we can actually kind of rewrite some of the memories that we have in ways that decrease those nightmares at night. Some people have said, does it matter if it's true? Right? Again, you're rewriting the end of something that actually happened. Like, does it matter if it was a true ending? Isn't it weird that it's not true? And what I will say is again, nope. Right? This rescripting research is really gaining a lot of traction. Okay. So, this is a shameless plug that I'm going to get to, and I actually raced through this material, which is good just not only for helping us catch up for the day, but also because I think it will allow some time for questions, hopefully. But what implications does this have for video imagery, right? Data-driven conclusions, best practices, they can only come with data. And so this is a project that I'm doing right now, and it is looking at the psychological impacts of exposure to video imagery. There are a lot of implications for call outcome when it comes to video imagery, because one of the things that I've argued is that there are ways in which having access to the video might help us learn more about the outcome. I was actually just on a phone call this morning with somebody from Northern Ireland, and he was talking about the access to video that they have. And he was talking about, of all things, kind of a horse. There was an accident involving a horse. It looked quite gruesome. The horse looked on video quite injured. But then they were able to see the rescue team come in, administer care to the horse. And in fact, very quickly after that, somebody was in fact riding the horse, right? Now, they you wouldn't necessarily know that by just kind of handling a call, hanging up, and never knowing what's happened. Never knowing what had happened, right? So video imagery does have some implications for call outcomes. So that's my way of kind of weaving this in. But to date, I have a little over 500 frontline folks who have completed the baseline survey. And what we're hoping to do is get a whole bunch of people to who have had access to video imagery and people who have not had access to video imagery complete a survey, so we can get some baseline kind of indicators of people's job satisfaction, their turnover intention, their stress levels, their access to video imagery, and then follow folks over time, knowing that some people will, in the course of the study, go from not having access to video to having access to video, and whether or not this is actually adversely impacting them. So this is a QR code to the baseline survey. If you are a frontline person, meaning that you consistently at work handle calls, please consider participating. It's on average taking people only about 7.5 minutes to complete the baseline survey. The goal is to re-administer every 3 months. If you don't consistently handle calls, I still love you, but don't participate in the survey, right? This is really for people who are very likely to be managing these types of calls. So please do consider completing it. If this doesn't apply to you, but you know who it might apply to, consider passing along the link that's associated with this QR code. Sign up for my newsletter. I'm going to start kind of sharing kind of helpful tips and some more immediate research findings. As a professor, the process of going through a kind of peer-reviewed manuscript submission, review, publication, it's like a 1 to 1.5 year process. It takes forever, but I want to start being able to communicate more of these results in real time, right? So that 3 years from now, I'm not finally sharing a paper with you based on data that I'm collecting today. So if you are interested, sign up for my newsletter. And there's my contact information. So if you have any questions, you can always email me either at lilyconsulting.com or through NIU. And with that, Ricardo, I am actually out of slides, which might be the first time in the history of the world that I have breezed through something like this as quickly as I breezed through. If you guys want to talk data, PTSD, anything in the middle, you just let me know.
All right. Excellent, excellent, as always. Thank you so, so much. Everything that you were saying, I was listening and going, "Mhm, yep, exactly." I don't see any questions in there. Oh, Missy is actually asking if you can put the QR code up again, please.
Yeah, that would require me. Yes, I can because I am tech competent.
Very much so. The way you
Oh, poor Ricardo.
laughed
Poor,
right
what,
away.
like we're all laughing about this because Ricardo knows that before this, not only did he have to walk me through registering for this conference, which I thought I had, but then resetting up my PowerPoint because I am technologically um,
Advanced.
unskilled, unskilled, in need of more skills.
Whatever, you're amazing, you know that. Now,
Mm,
actually, there are 2 questions that just popped in here, so this is good. So while you're
fantastic.
doing that, or actually
Okay,
put that up there, and,
I am.
then
I'm
I'll
going
go
to.
ahead and we'll go through the questions here because I wanna make sure
Okay.
to that they get recorded on here.
Okay. Look at me doing this correctly.
Oh,
Except for
snap.
because I'm in presentation mode, I gotta like I'm just doing this. Sorry, just ignore me.
You know what I'm gonna clip this, and I'm gonna
Oh, there we
caption it.
go. Look at me.
Oh, okay.
Look at
Dang
me.
it. I was gonna say, I'm gonna caption it to be like, "This is how fast the session went."
I figured out something in real time. Look
Woo!
at this.
All right, there we go. And I think it was yes, there we go. So, did you have 2 QR codes or just that one?
Well, this is the for the data collection
Oh,
project.
okay. Yep, this is the one. She said,
Yep.
"Thank you." All
Okay,
right.
good.
All right, let me go ahead and put this first one up there on the screen. It'll pop up there. I'll read it as well. It says, "So when you say PTSD is treatable, is it worth getting diagnosed? And then or is the, treatment via therapy?"
Okay. Oh, you first of all, thank you for asking this question, Chelsea. But you've like already like I'm already having a physiological reaction. Okay, it is critical if you are seeing anybody, mental health practitioner, if they are not starting with a formal diagnostic procedure to identify whether or not you actually qualify for a PTSD diagnosis, then find somebody else. Okay. What we know is that the evidence-based treatments that we have for PTSD, they're really remarkably effective if you actually have PTSD symptoms, right? They are meant to target the PTSD symptoms. And what I have seen happen is people, first of all, people misdiagnose all the time. So all the time I have people coming into my clinical practice and they say, I know that I have PTSD. And because I always start with a formal diagnostic procedure, oftentimes they are not correct, right? They might have some symptoms of PTSD, but they actually don't meet qualifications. Then we talk about what other options are available for them, right? I have worked with people all the time where they come and they say, I know that I have PTSD. I was doing EMDR. I was doing this other therapy. It wasn't working for me. I figured I'd give it another go. I do a diagnostic interview, and in fact, they don't have PTSD. So I'm like, the things that you were doing to target your PTSD didn't work because you don't actually have PTSD, right? You have generalized anxiety, right? Or you're struggling with depression. You might have a couple little symptoms of PTSD over here that we can try to tackle in other ways. But if you don't actually kind of have diagnostic threshold level symptoms of PTSD, then these evidence-based treatments are less likely to work. So it's a really critical first step. And what we know is that when we use these treatments for people who have PTSD, the recovery rate is very high, right? It's not 100%, and people do sometimes drop out because the treatments are hard, right? We know that in the context of PTSD, people become very reliant on avoidant methods of coping. And in therapy, we're not avoiding, right? So sometimes people make the decision to terminate therapy early. But for those who have PTSD and they get one of these treatments, their success rate is very, very high. I think I
Excellent.
answered the question.
Yes.
Okay.
So the next question here says, what should be done with the info journaled?
Oh, with the info that's journaled. Okay. You could do whatever you like with it, right? Um, you can just keep it in a journal, right? You can kind of keep it in on your bedstand. You can keep it in your office. You can keep it wherever you like. Sometimes people select to do something with that information, right? Sometimes they select to share it with other people so that other people understand what they've gone through. It's a method of getting some sort of social support, peer support. Sometimes people engage in some sort of other kind of almost ritual with it, right? So sometimes people will take these memories that they've written down and they've processed, and they will bury them, right? Or they might kind of throw them into a fire or doing something else that will help signal kind of the release of the story as a memory that now can kind of go out into the universe. You don't have to sit and hold on to. I know some people who have held on to the journal or their kind of journal writing, and they will go back to it from time to time. And what you will probably notice is that going back and reading it, your distress goes down. And then later, a year or two later, if you go back and read it, you might still feel sad, right? You might still have some physiological responding. But sometimes it's really therapeutic for people to realize that with time and with engaging with the memory over and over, that distress level really tends to go down. Um, if it doesn't, then it might be time to seek out some more formal therapeutic options.
Perfect. All right. Let me go back down here. So those were the questions. I don't know if you saw the bottom comment there.
Oh, I had done a symptom tracker initially, and I just so um so a symptom tracker can be helpful, right? So a symptom tracker in and of itself is not kind of part of it's not like a treatment, right? Per se. But I say that because what we know is that when people track their own symptoms of distress over time, there tends to be some natural remission of symptoms. And oftentimes that is because people are engaging in more problems focused coping, they're doing more active strategies. And what we know is simply acknowledging and knowing and having insight into ways that we're struggling, oftentimes even unconsciously redirects our behavior and our thinking in ways that oftentimes lead towards better health. So sometimes this is a tool that we use in therapy all the time. We have people can track their thoughts, they track their symptoms, and that in and of itself can be helpful. So if I have somebody track the number of times a day that they say really negative things to themselves about themselves, they oftentimes will come back to therapy the next week and say, "Oh my God, I'm fearful to myself, right? But I really want to do something about this." Or I've noticed that these things keep bothering me, or these types of things keep coming up. And it's a really great way for us to kind of recognize where this distress is, where to go from there. But just symptom tracking in and of itself has some therapeutic effects.
Very nice. As always, phenomenal. Excellent work, and, just to everybody here, it's always an honor to have you part of this and, just to chat with you in general, just talking about a lot of this stuff. We all have kind of this, the same mission and goal. Those foundations and everything are there and stuff. We might be off doing, different parts of it, but ultimately, we're here for each other, and that's how this all works, and support
Yeah.
each other. So thank you so
Yeah.
much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, both Ricardo and everybody else. And I sit here and chat about this stuff literally all day long. So thank you for having me, and hopefully I didn't go down too many rabbit holes,
No.
chasing rabbits all over the place.
No, it was excellent, and, as we were getting closer to this, it was definitely the final countdown, and it was great.
Okay, just really quickly. So Ricardo had a meeting on Friday, and he among speakers, and I was not able to attend, but he labeled it the final countdown. And I, since Friday, have had an earworm of it's the final countdown. And then even going into the day, like I woke up and pretty soon I'm like, why is that in my brain again? So I blame you for all my difficult 80 songs that I can't get out of my head.
You are very
80?
welcome.
Okay.
And now everybody who watches this, those currently here and watching in a replay, they're gonna have it as well. So,
Oh,
yes, we did
great.
it. We
Great.
did it.
Ricardo seems to find ways to make me sing every time I get on here, despite the
I
fact
know.
that I'm the worst singer ever. One of my daughter's first sentences to me was, "No, mama, sing.
Oh,
No,
man.
mama, sing." Yeah.
Well, what can you do?
I'm like, "Oh, right."
Like, right? Just like, "How dare you? I gave you
Well, I
life."
thought I was soothing you, but apparently I've been giving you nightmares. So great. Good job, mom.
Oh, man, that is funny. Well, I've got, your information and everything that we've added to, the
Fantastic.
community as well, and, just man, everybody follow what my homie here, Dr. Michelle Lilly, is doing. She's doing some excellent work, and I'm going to be bringing all of you to the next one. We've got a next session that's coming up, and it's called Stress Management and You. So we will be jumping over to that one soon. Thank you again very much, and we'll see you all in the next one.
All right. Thanks, everyone.